while I'm doing that, some of the strays will appear, I trust. Speaker, Dr. Richard Wescott, and as usual, I'm going to say he had adequate introduction in our mailer for tonight's meeting, so I'll just send it right over to him. And I will warn you that that light is not very firmly affixed.
Now, before I get started, the mention that Warren made about having films strikes me as a good idea. I'm not a member of the roundtable, but I taught courses on American history on film. And one of the films that I used to use was The Birth of a Nation, which portrays not only the war period but goes into the Reconstruction period. Has an interesting Maine connection, indirect one. During the period when the Republican Party got started in the 1850s, one of the leading political figures in Maine at that time was a man by the name of James Shepherd Pike from Calais. And he worked for the New York Tribune as a reporter for Horace Greeley. And after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, he went down into the South, and particularly into South Carolina, and sent back a series of articles on conditions in the state of South Carolina, particularly the South Carolina legislature. Well, some 20 years or so later, a novelist by the name of Thomas Dixon wrote a novel based on the Reconstruction period called The Klansman. That book was one which apparently circulated in Maine in the 1920s when the Klan had a revival here in this state as well as many other northern states. D.W. Griffith, famous film producer and director, adapted The Birth of a Nation from that novel by Dixon, which, as I said, you can trace back through the articles that James Shepherd Pike wrote in the Reconstruction period. Pike being from Alice. All right, tonight, oh, by the way, you can rent films from the Metropolitan Museum of Art really reasonably. You can also rent them from the Library of Congress and some other federal agencies as well, all relatively inexpensive. Now, tonight I'm going to talk about the development of the Republican Party in Maine and relate it to the onset of the Civil War. And I want to start off by just reviewing some things which some of you are probably quite familiar with. On the 6th of November, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States, and Hannibal Hamlin of Maine was elected as Vice President. Now, if you want to be technical, of course, which some of you may, they weren't elected until the electors cast their ballots a little while later, but for all intents and purposes, they were elected at that time. They had a majority of electoral votes, which you have to be elected, but they were not recipients of the majority of the popular vote. Some of you are probably aware. They were plurality winners of that election. Now, Abraham Lincoln had run in 1858 against Stephen Douglas for the senator, one of the senator positions from the state of Illinois, a very famous political campaign. And when he was nominated by the Republican Party in Illinois, he delivered an acceptance speech, which has become known over the years as the House Divided speech. And in that speech, what he said was that in his view at that time that the United States could not remain as a nation divided, that it could not remain as a nation half slave and half free. And what he anticipated in the eventual run of things was that it was going to become a nation without slavery. Hannibal Hamlin, who had been in the Congress back during the Mexican War, had been a supporter of the Wilmot Proviso at that time, which was a congressional vote passed by the House of Representatives on a number of occasions and never passed the Senate, which was going to exclude slavery from any territory that we acquired as a result of the Mexican War. So both of these candidates of the Republican Party were on record, in essence, in viewing a future for the United States of being one in which slavery no longer existed. It was because of these attitudes and the attitude of the Republican Party as a whole, which had virtually swept the northern electoral votes. The vote in 1860 was largely a sectional vote. The North supporting, by and large, the Republican Party. It was that circumstance that led to a series of events in the next 6 weeks. On the 2nd of December, roughly a month after the general election, in South Carolina, an ordinance of secession was voted, and South Carolina government, the people in South Carolina, said that they were quitting the Union. Now, the idea of secession was not a new one. It had been cast about rather extensively in southern states in the year preceding the election, as the drift of events had indicated that perhaps the Republicans might win the election in 1860. Within the next 6 weeks or so, the remainder of the Deep South states also seceded from the Union, from Texas eastward through Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. So we had 7 states that had left the Union, they said, before Lincoln was actually inaugurated on the 4th of March, 1861. Now, in his inaugural address, let me make one other point before I inaugurate Lincoln. By the time that he was inaugurated, those 7 deep southern states had not only had seceded from the Union, but they had also formed what they called the Confederate States of America. They held a convention, delegates from those states, and created what they said now was a new national state, separate from the United States. This was done on the basis of exercising what they regarded as a constitutional leaving of the United States. Well, Lincoln, in his inaugural address on the 4th of March, made it quite clear that he was not going to accept the idea that any states had left the Union. He said that the Union had existed prior to the Constitution, that the Union was recognized in the Constitution. There was no constitutional way in which the states could secede from the Union. The Union was permanent. Go back to the point that I made before. This was a permanent union, and earlier he said that ultimately it was going to be a union without slavery. Further, in his inaugural address, he goes on to say that he has taken an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, and that is exactly what he intends to do. And that if there is resistance to the carrying out of the laws of the United States through what he regards as the entire territory of the United States, that is in those 7 states that they have quit the Union and formed their own government, that he will have to, in essence, employ whatever means are necessary to see to it that the laws of the United States and the possessions of the U.S. government, such things as forts, that they will be protected by the federal government of the United States. And he said that if any violence, however, occurs as a result of this, it will not be because of his actions. It will be because of people who resist with force the laws of the United States. Well, of course, it did not take long for the laws of the United States to be forcibly resisted, because barely over a week after Lincoln was inaugurated, when it became clear that he was going to, barely a month after he was inaugurated, when it became clear that he was attempting to resupply Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. that the Confederate forces drawn up around the harbor fired on Fort Sumter, and as we're all well aware, that in essence launched the Civil War. Lincoln called for volunteers within a few days thereafter for 3-month volunteers, which, of course, looking at this after the fact, was a height of over-optimism, apparently. And when he did so, within a matter of a few days, 4 more states said that they were seceding from the Union because, in essence, they did not regard it as proper for the government of the United States to use force against those 7 states that had already seceded: Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee. So that ultimately 11 states quit the Union. The war, as you're well aware, went on for 4 years. It was a very bitter war, a very bloody war. Over 600,000 deaths, many of them in battle, but many others by disease and so on. And there was an outburst of popular support at the beginning of the war for trying to end this rebellion. Many thousands, indeed, over 70,000 ultimately served in the Union forces from Maine, and some 7,000 plus of those lost their lives. So it was a very bloody conflict, and in terms of loss of lives, in terms of people who were injured and lost limbs and things of that sort, in terms of tremendous impact on the United States. The southern states were decimated by the war, physical destruction of towns, cities, railroad communication lines, so on and so forth. Now, the question that I really want to address here tonight, after that brief review of what occurred in the between November of 1860 and March, April of 1861, is how, in essence, did this national crisis come about, and more particularly, what were the events in Maine that led to the rise of the Republican Party here, and the ultimate involvement of Maine in the war. Now, one of the things that have been occurring in the United States ever since the drafting of the Constitution, it's 1988, we're still in the, well, probably by this time most people have forgotten about it because of all the hullabaloo last year, but technically we're still in the process of celebrating the bicentennial of the Constitution. The new government of the United States did not get underway until 1789, so believe it or not, in case you've forgotten about it, we're still bicentennialing the Constitution on through the rest of this year and on into next year, before you get the 200th anniversary of the beginnings of the government of the United States. Well, in the Constitution as it was drafted in 1787 and approved by the states in 1787-88, the issue of slavery was debated in the Constitutional Convention, or at least it came up on a number of points in the Constitutional Convention, and in essence, compromises were arrived at. Slaves were counted for purposes of representation, even though obviously in the South they were not allowed to vote. They were not really regarded as persons. But as it ended up, 3/5 of the slaves, 60% of them, could be counted as, for the purpose of choosing members to the Congress of the United States, which also had an impact on the electoral vote, which is allotted by on the same basis. The issue of the slave trade. There were people who wanted to end it immediately, but a 20-year extension was allowed, and it could not be ended until 1808. So the whole question of slavery, in essence, was, in a sense, swept under the rug in the Constitutional Convention. It was something which they could not agree upon, so they compromised it as best they could at that time. But the question of slavery kept coming up. That is, the existence of slavery in the United States. And, of course, the emergence of Maine as a separate state after some 25 years or so of efforts by people in Maine to separate from Massachusetts was intimately tied to the issue of slavery. The Compromise of 1820 not only brought Maine into the Union as a state and Missouri into the Union as a state in which slaves could be owned, but it also addressed the question of the existence of slavery in the territory then owned by the United States where that question had not yet been addressed. In 1787, prior to the Constitution, the old Confederation Congress had enacted an ordinance called the Northwest Ordinance, which said slavery could not exist in the Northwest Territory, that is, in essence, the area that is now the 3 states south of the Great Lakes, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, that slavery would not be allowed in that area. The South did not particularly object to that. It's north of the Ohio River. They didn't really anticipate that many people would be wanting to move their slaves in there anyhow, because generally people, we now know, migrate. Perhaps this is not true so much as it was in the 19th century, but then they tend to migrate more or less westward. Went west from the Atlantic Ocean. They didn't go northwest. They didn't go southwest. Generally, they just went west. So the people south of the Mason-Dixon line were not really anticipating going up into the area, and so there wasn't too much objection to that exclusion of slavery. But in 1803, of course, the Jefferson administration had arranged a sort of emergency sale by Napoleon of the Louisiana area, about 800,000 square miles of territory, more or less. No one knew exactly where it ended, where it started, what its western limits were, what its northern limits were, and so on. But Jefferson bought whatever it was that Napoleon was selling. At that point, no one was moving that far west, but by 1820, people had started to move into the Louisiana Purchase area, and the question arose as to whether or not Missouri, which was applying for statehood, would be allowed to be admitted to the Union as a slave state. First time the question had come up: should there be slavery in the Louisiana Purchase area? Well, ultimately, as we know, a compromise was worked out. There, as Jefferson said, the bringing up of this question of slavery in the territories rang like a fire bell in the night, as he put it. The slavery question had been quiescent ever since the Constitutional Convention period. And now suddenly it came up, and there were heated debates in the Congress over this question, whether there should be slavery in the territory and whether Missouri should be admitted and so on. Well, Maine and Missouri, they finally worked out that arrangement. And a line was drawn across the Louisiana Purchase area along what is now the southern border of Missouri, in which it said that the area south of that there could be more slave states admitted, which turned out in essence to be Arkansas. And north of that line, there would be no more slave states, which included most of the rest of the Louisiana Purchase area, which ran all the way up to what is now the border of, turned out up to the border of Canada and out roughly to the Rocky Mountains. Later on, Southerners thought that it had been a bad deal, but they didn't think so at that point. So the slavery question there was compromised, and for a time there was no further problem about it. And not until the next time the United States got more territory, added more territory to the United States, as a result of, one, the annexation of Texas, and two, the Mexican War, which followed shortly after the annexation of Texas in the middle of the 1840s. Now, the slavery question, each time that there is an attempt to compromise it, eventually it keeps coming up again as a major national political issue in Maine and throughout the rest of the country, each time the United States adds more territory. But in each of these instances, ultimately in the Missouri Compromise in 1820, in what is known as the Compromise of 1850, which came about in regard to the territory that we had acquired from Mexico as a result of the Mexican War, compromises were eventually worked out. ultimately it turned out that the slavery issue was not compromisable because opinion had shifted in the North sufficiently to say that it was not compromisable any longer. Now, I'm going to come back to that point later on. Before I go on along that vein, however, I want to describe to you the political context in the United States during the late 1830s, 1840s, into the first half or so of the 1850s. Period of some 20, 25 years or so. From roughly 1832 to 1856, there existed in the United States what historians and political scientists refer to as the second party system. The first party system existed back in the 1790s and on through the Jefferson-Madison administrations. And then there were two parties at that time, not too well organized, not too well articulated as modern parties are, but there were recognizable political parties, the Jeffersonian, the Jeffersonian Republican, or the Democratic Republican. All three names mean the same group, the people associated with Jefferson and Madison and so on. And on the other hand, the Federalists, the party of George Washington, John Adams, and so on. But that party system gradually broke down after the War of 1812, and a second one had ultimately developed, but not until the early part of the 1830s. Now, in that second party system, just to refresh your memories if you're a little shaky on this, in the second party system there were two national parties. The Whig Party, W-H-I-G, Whig, and the Democratic Party, or as it was called in those days, the Democracy. You usually see it referred to as the Democratic Party, but its official name was the Democracy. Anyone know where the name Whig came from? Excuse me? Oh. The name Whig is worth mentioning here because it symbolized what the Whig Party was about when it got started, anyhow. It got started basically as a party of opposition to Andrew Jackson and all the things that Andrew Jackson ever did, and all of his policies. It was a reference coming back out of English political history when the Whigs in England, the Whig Party in England, opposed the kings of England, the Whigs that, in essence, brought about the shift from the Stuart family to the Hanover family in England, brought in the Georges and so on. And what it in England meant was opposition to uncontrolled royal authority. Well, Andrew Jackson, by his opponents, came to be known as King Andrew, and hence the Whig Party became people who were opposed to his, what they regarded as kingly authoritarian behavior. Well, these two parties that made up the second party system evolved stands on basically three issues on which they opposed one another. One of those was the question of the Bank of the United States, a central bank. There had been a Bank of the United States set up back in the 1790s during the Washington administration. It eventually had been ended and then recreated again during the Madison administration. And Andrew Jackson did not like the Bank of the United States and eventually was able to prevent it from being rechartered when its charter expired. It had a 20-year charter. The Democratic Party opposed central banking. The Whig Party generally supported it, thought that it was important for the development of the national economy. Actually, the United States went without a central bank from the mid-1830s down into the period of the Civil War when a new one was created, partly as a device to sell government bonds to help finance the Civil War. Couldn't start a federally chartered bank unless you bought a certain amount of government bonds. Now, another issue that separated those two parties was the question of the tariff. How high should tariff rates be? Should there be a tariff? They generally didn't disagree that there should be a tariff, but whether there should be a highly protective tariff. The Whigs favored that because generally the Whigs tend to support economic development. They wanted the government to be involved in helping the economy to develop. They wanted a bank, lend money, and so on and so forth. They wanted a highly protective tariff rate to protect infant American industry. And the other issue was a question of what they called in those days internal improvements, meaning better road construction, ultimately railroad construction and canal construction. The Whig Party generally favoring the idea that the government ought to help subsidize and support those kinds of efforts, improve communication to go along with the idea of the bank making credit available and the tariff protection. The Democratic Party generally not being in favor of federal government, certainly, and even perhaps state government involvement in internal improvement projects. But during this period, these were basically economic issues. As I said, after the Compromise of 1820, which was prior to the second party system beginning, the slavery issue was allayed until the middle of the 1840s and the Texas annexation Mexican War period. So these two parties, the Whig and the Democratic parties, debated these issues, and they, especially after Jackson ended his second term in office and was replaced by poor Martin Van Buren of New York, who came in just in time, inaugurated in March of 1837, just in time to be there for the beginning of one of the worst depressions and panics in American economic history, the Panic or Depression of 1837, that lasted for half a dozen years or so. Now, these were national parties. It's an important point to make about this second party system. The Whig Party functioned in the South. It ran candidates in every state in the South. Its presidential candidates were supported in every state in the South and in the North. The Whig Party was a national party. The Democratic Party was a national party. The 1830s on into the early part of the 1840s and even into the middle of the 1840s. It's a period of intense party competition. What is regarded as the beginnings of modern approach to political campaigning, of course, came, as some of you may be aware, in the election of 1840. The Tippecanoe and Tyler II campaign, the log cabin campaign, when William Henry Harrison, who I may be mistaken about this, I believe was the oldest man to be elected president until we had Ronald Reagan elected as president. Harrison didn't do as well as Ronald Reagan. He died 30 days or so after he was inaugurated as president. Now, Harrison was a Whig, but his vice presidential candidate, former Congressman John C. Tyler, was really a Democrat who hated Andrew Jackson and dropped out of the Democratic Party and got into the Whig Party, so that when he became president, you had a man who wasn't really a Whig as president, and it caused all sorts of trouble within the political party because he began appointing people to various kinds of posts and offending people who thought that they were better Whigs than the people that he was appointing because they thought that they were really weak Whigs or semi-Democrats or something of that sort. But that campaign in 1840 kicked off another thing which is characteristic of a second party system, large voter turnouts. Up until that time, up until the beginning of the second party system anyway, voter turnout had been relatively low, 60-some% typically in presidential election years and so on. With the beginning of that famous 1840 campaign, suddenly election vote turnout was jumping up to 75-80% of the people who were eligible to vote were voting. Really, by present-day standards, when we're down in the 50% range in presidential voting, really makes these people look like good citizens. Now, the voting commonly was close, however, even though during this period the Democratic Party tended to dominate the federal government. The voting tended to be relatively close. at least the popular vote anyhow. The country was fairly evenly split between Whig and Democratic support. As long as there was no slavery issue disrupting things, people were pretty evenly divided on the economic questions, and the voting reflected that. Now, this was a highly, one point I think is very important to make, this was a highly political era. One of the things that existed then that does not exist today was that there were state elections about 2/3 of the months of the year. In March, April, May, June, and July, August, September, November. Each year, not every 2 years like you tend to get now in state elections and so on, but then every year for 8 months. In 8 months of the year, there was a political campaign going on somewhere in the United States, covered in party newspapers from one end of the country to the other. Many people tend to think, well, it's back in 1840s and 50s, that was a long time ago, and things were a lot more dull back then. Everyone knows that. But actually, in terms of politics, things were probably much more exciting back then than they are today. A political campaign today is considerably different than it was then as a result of the television and so forth. But then to go to a political rally was something to do. It was something exciting. Go there, parades, and people handing out food, so on and so forth. It was a highly political era. Debating, of course, essentially these same kinds of questions, however, the bank, the tariff, and internal improvements, and so on. Now, when there was a changeover from one party to the other, nationally and at the local level, of course, this was a period, one of the things that Andrew Jackson had stood for and had made popular in American politics, although it certainly had preceded him. Jefferson had done the same thing when he became president back in 1801, was rotation in office. You win the election, you throw out the other rascals and put yourself in. And then if they happen to win another year or 2 or 4 later, depending on whether they're talking about national or state or whatever elections, then there's another rotation around. Out go the Democrats, in come the Whigs. Out go the Whigs, in come the Democrats. Unfortunately, however, when the parties tended to get factionalized, as they did in some places, it became really a kind of bloodbath as to who was going to get appointed to office. Customs districts, custom house districts, or revenue districts. In Maine, there were a half dozen of them, and you had a collector of customs, you had a treasurer of customs, and you had various kinds of inspectors and weighers and gauges and so on and so forth. In every custom district in Maine, there were dozens of appointees. And of course, you wanted to be appointed, then you were a party worker when it came around for the time of the political campaign. These were the party workers. Party workers were people who got appointed. Not much different than today, of course. Post offices. If you were a postmaster and you were a Whig and the Democrats came in, you went out. Democrat came in, sorted the mail for a while, and then if they lost, then they went out, and the Whig came in, and the Whig sorted the mail for a while, and so on. Several hundred post offices in Maine. In those days, every little town, of course, was apt to have 2 or 3 different post offices. It even reached into the lighthouse keeping service. If you were a lighthouse keeper, you were apt to get tossed out on your ear if you were of the wrong party. Newspapers were highly political, yeah. Well, actually, from Jackson's point of view, it didn't make any difference anyway, because essentially he believed, as you probably know, that most government jobs actually ought to be so simple that anyone could do them anyway. Contrary to today, in order to be in the government, somebody's supposed to be a big expert on this or an expert on that. So his attitude was to keep the government simple and bring in any citizen to do the job. I don't really know that much about the Jackson period as to what was happening when he came in. I certainly would agree with you that the idea of he being the creator of spoilsmanship undoubtedly was overrated, because when Jefferson came in, a lot of Federalists went out and so forth. If anything, he may have talked for.
Someone just did some work on this and came up with a figure that Jackson only actually replaced 70% of the people he could have gotten rid of. And I would think that on local level, you know, the party wanted to be best people to get rid of, you know, the guy running the post office was doing a good job.
Well, you know, I don't know. As I say, I don't know about Jackson, or the 7% seems kind of low to me, but that's just sort of a gut reaction. That's just kind of a gut reaction to it. But the later the period that I'm more familiar with, the 1840s and 50s, yeah, it reached down pretty low because people wanted government jobs. It wasn't so much necessarily that the party leaders in Washington or in the leaders within the state of Maine, for example, senators and so forth, it wasn't so much that they wanted to throw people, but people were begging for jobs. I voted for the Democrats. I've got a right to be appointed. Or I voted for the Whigs. I got a right to be appointed. And it got to the point where during the 1840s, after one of the elections, Senator Fairfield, he found out there were so many people coming down to Washington trying to get a job. He said that some of his supporters back in Maine, that you better write letters to these people down here in Washington that if I find out that a person who's looking for a job is down here in Washington, he's not going to get one. So they stopped coming around and bothering him, trying to get his ear to get this, that, or whatever position. And particularly in the collectorships, there were real battles by people within a party against one another to get these jobs, and the people that were in did go out. Because these were jobs that had some real money attached to them, whereas the postmasterships weren't really that financially important. But in the collectorships, some of the jobs of collector and some of the lesser, still higher level administrative posts were fairly remunerative.
I know that after the period after the Civil War, you really did the Democrats become tremendous machines.
Oh yeah.
Which you do find eliminating every single postmaster in the state and replacing them. I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, I would say that the shift in that direction certainly comes in the 1840s and 50s. It may well not have, the parties perhaps probably were not that well organized back during Jackson's period, because really the second party system doesn't really begin until the 1832-36 period, when Jackson is on his way out, at the very end of his tenure of office. So to summarize here, then, in this period, the 1840s and 50s, down in the middle of the 50s, you had a highly politicized situation. These people were fighting for office. You had national parties operating on a national scale. Now, another element that's part of this picture is that this is sometimes referred to as the Age of Reform, same period, 1830s to 1850s. But sometimes known as the Age of Reform, because there was a lot of interest in reforming American society, which is kind of common. We've been talking about reforming American society ever since we threw the British out, at least. Well, actually, even the Puritans were talking about the need to reform American society and so on. But just let me list a few of these reform things that were going on, and then focus on two of them in particular. There were many communitarian experiments during this period. People who thought that by forming a community of like believers who were interested in, who thought that society could be improved by, let us say, economic justice, or could be improved by a more committed religious life, or could be improved by rearranging the structure of married life and things of that sort, that either one, if you were so fed up with the society around you that you could withdraw with fellow believers into a community and isolate yourself, and then, as the expression of the 60s was, do your thing, without other people bothering you, or else you could create a community and use it as a kind of example in hopes that other people would emulate you. So there's a lot of communitarianism during this period. There was also a great deal of interest in education reform, improvements in public education, and many private educational institutions established, and I'm talking here particularly about secondary ones, academies, things of that sort. A great deal of interest in prison reform. Today we hear a lot about the problems of prison overcrowding and so on and so forth. Need to reform the prisons. The same thing was true back during this period. There's a great deal of interest in how to deal with prisoners, how to reform these people. Not only do you punish them, but perhaps the hope of idea of reforming them, so when they came out they would not commit the crimes that they had or others again. Reform in the treatment of the insane, and of course a Maine woman whose name keeps coming up, and so you're thinking, oh, Maine, Dorothea Dix, over to the college the other day, and the woman who started working as the receptionist in the student union, somehow or other she was talking with a student there, and he said, do you know? She said, no, I don't know anything about, I never heard of Dorothea Dix. So, of course, I immediately straightened her out on that, what an important person Dorothea Dix was, and I said, you can go up to Hampton, Maine, and have a picnic in the Dorothea Dix Park up there that commemorates her. The American Peace Society was formed during this period, and the idea of ending war in the world and settling disputes by peaceful means and so on. And another main figure was prominent in that, William Ladd. So this was an era in which there was a great deal of interest in, not only was the political pot constantly boiling, but that there were a great many people agitating for change in American society. Now, the more far-reaching ones immediately at that time, I suppose, were the women's rights movement, which got kicked off in 1848 at the famous convention in Seneca Falls, New York, by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and some other women. But most importantly for my purposes here tonight, the temperance prohibition movement. Americans had been heavy drinkers ever since the colonial period. Per capita consumption of alcohol was higher back then than it is now, and a great deal of concern had developed about its impact on American society. And, of course, one of the leading figures, and I'll have more to say about him shortly, in the United States in advocating temperance and then ultimately prohibition was Neil Dow of Portland. I used to ask my students when I was still teaching history, so I've never quite been able to understand why it is that several prominent reformers of this period came from the state of Maine. And I finally concluded maybe it was just boredom in the long winters before downhill and cross-country skiing and so forth that they sat around and thought about this stuff or something. The other volatile, in terms of its impact, reform movement, aside from temperance prohibition, was the abolition movement. In the 1830s, the abolition movement in the United States moved into high gear. There have been people around before this who were advocating the abolition of slavery. But in the 1830s, in the early part of the 1830s, the American Anti-Slavery Society was formed. And operating basically from two bases, one in Massachusetts and one out in Ohio. In the 1830s, the American Anti-Slavery Society became very vocal in urging that slavery was a unchristian act, arguing that it had a negative impact not only on the people that were enslaved, but on the people who were the enslavers, that it caused them to behave in brutish fashion and so on. And in both of these reform movements, the temperance ultimately Prohibition movement and the Abolition movement, both of them were taken up rather vigorously in Maine. Obviously, the temperance prohibition one was with Neil Dow operating in Portland. Now, back about 20-some years ago, a sociologist interested in the question of reform wrote a book called The Symbolic Crusade. And it's a rather interesting book in which he deals with the temperance prohibition movement all the way from this period of the the latter part of the 18th century up until the enactment of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act and so on. But what interested me about his book, and I think it's a valuable suggestion, he suggested that in many of these reform movements there were two stages, what he called the assimilative stage, in which the reformers tried to get the people that they were talking to assimilate their values. That is, to not drink so much in the temperance period, or to not drink at all in the prohibition period. Or in the case of the abolitionist movement, to convince slaveholders that they ought not to hold slaves, that they ought to emancipate their slaves, that they should assimilate the values of the abolitionists, that slavery was an evil. But Gusfield went on and made the point that in these reform movements, however, eventually they moved into what he calls the coercive phase. Since propaganda, discussion, so on, was not doing an adequate job, that the reform was not taking place fast enough or even at all, then obviously the people who were misbehaving would have to be coerced, forced. In other words, enact laws, make them behave properly, pass a law against what they were doing, or laws against what they were doing. And so it's in the 1840s and 1850s that these two reform movements that have such a profound political impact in Maine shift over from assimilative reform to coercive reform. The Maine Temperance Society becomes the Maine Temperance Union, and the name change went along with the shift from trying to convince people, propagandize and so forth, to making it illegal to drink or to regulate the sale of liquor, to in essence make it useful, the sale of liquor available only for medicinal and industrial purposes, as they like to put it, and to use the power of the federal government to end slavery in the instance of the slavery question. So it's during this period you're beginning to get this shift early on in the 1840s, at the time when the slavery question, the early 1840s, the slavery extension question, is beginning to come up because of the annexation of Texas and because of the Mexican War and the subsequent acquiring of what's now the southwest of the United States, Arizona, New Mexico, Arizona, and of course California are also in the process of that war. Now, one other thing about the general context that we're operating in. The United States during this period was in a period of rapid economic growth. And this was true in Maine as it was in other parts of the country. In Maine, this is a period of considerable prosperity in terms of the lumbering operations that were going on, and tens of millions of board feet of lumber were being shipped out of the Maine during the 1830s, 1840s, and even on into the 50s. Farming was still fairly prosperous in Maine during this period, even though in some of the more hilly country of Oxford County and some of those places, some people were leaving and shipping out to Ohio and so forth. Maine, generally farming in Maine was still relatively prosperous. The crisis in farming in Maine didn't come until the end of the 19th century. This is a period when Maine was one of the leading shipbuilding states in the country. It was also a leading state in terms of ship ownership, a tonnage that was owned, and the people who were owning ships were doing a fine business during this period. This is a period when fishing in Maine was very prosperous. So generally, in spite of the depression associated with 1837, by the 1840s, generally things were really quite prosperous. We're talking about a society in which there is a fair degree of prosperity. There is interest in reform. the political parties are highly active, arguing about economic issues for the most part. Now, in the 1840s, however, things begin to change because of the attempt and ultimately the successful attempt to annex Texas to the United States. Texas had thrown off Mexican control, Mexican authorities, people living in Texas who were Americans who had migrated there back in the 1820s, threw off control of the government of Mexico in the 1830s, and for 10 years or so had their own independent existence, and by the 1840s, interest in the United States and annexing Texas to the United States had developed. But then that, as I mentioned before, kicked off this whole question, well, what about slavery? Going to add a slave state to the United States and may kick off a war with Mexico. Interest in acquiring Texas is only the interest of the slave-owning part of the United States. I'd like to make a few remarks at this point before going on and outlining exactly how the Republican Party got started in Maine. That leads Maine on toward the Civil War. I want to say something about the political context of Maine. What the electoral process was like in Maine at that time, because it was greatly different than it is today. As I mentioned earlier, there was an election every year, a state election every year for the House, House of Representatives, State Senate, governorship, Governor's Council, which no longer exists in Maine, and we've done away with a while back, state treasurer, state secretary of state, and so on. Also, there was the election of county officers, as well as, of course, the annual town meetings that we're familiar with. Now, there are certain peculiarities about the electoral process at that time that don't exist today. One was an absolute majority rule. If you were running for the Senate of Maine, State Senate, you had to have an absolute majority of the votes. You could not be elected as a plural on the basis of a plurality, just simply having the majority of the vote. And it commonly occurred that you'd have a quarter, a third, sometimes even more of the state senate that wasn't elected. No one got elected on election day. Under the rules that then operated then, the House of Representatives and those senators who had been elected got together and they chose to fill the vacant seats by voting for the two candidates in each district that had gotten the highest number of votes. And they'd fill the vacancies in that fashion. The same thing was true of the governorship. If you did not have an absolute majority of the votes, then you would not be elected as governor. Rather, what was done was to take the top vote getters, and then the House of Representatives would choose from the top 4 vote getters 2 people whose names would then be sent to the state senate after the vacancies in the state senate had been filled, those that hadn't been elected, the process I just described a minute ago, and then the state senate would choose the governor. Well, you see, it was a rather complex kind of thing because every year, as I said, commonly they had to go through this business because not everyone would get elected by a majority. Now, the significance of this in the long run was that it meant that if you had a smaller party, a third party, that had a sufficient amount of voting support, not a lot, but a sufficient amount to get 2 or 3 or 4 people elected. In certain circumstances, those 2 or 3 or 4, or sometimes it turned out 5 or 6 or 8 people, could wield a lot of influence. They could exert pressure far beyond their numbers. And as you shall see, this is, in essence, what happened. Now, the parties in those days were organized where there were cities, a few cities that were in Maine. They're organized on a ward basis. I had county committees that were elected by county conventions. The Whigs had their county conventions. The Democrats had their county conventions. They chose a county committee. They chose candidates for county office. You had a state senatorial district committees, and in those days, if you had been a state senator from, say, the 1st District, which would include a couple of counties, Cumberland and York, and you were from York County, after serving 2 terms, it was the accepted practice, it wasn't by law or anything, but it was the accepted practice that you would then voluntarily retire, and there's another aspect of this rotation in office thing, when it was rotation of party nomination. Quite different than today when we have professional politicians or professional public servants or whatever they call themselves who go into the House of Representatives of the state of Maine, and they get in the state Senate, and then they might go to the Congress, and then they come back to be governor, and then they go to the presidency or whatever, and they spend 30, 40 years being 10 years in this office and 8 or 10 in that office and so on. So it was quite different back then. In a sense, in small d democratic terms, it was more democratic. More people were given a chance to be public servants. If you look at the same thing was true of the House of Representatives. Rotation. 2 terms and out. Just by practice, not by law. Hamlin was congressman for 2 terms. Out. You look at the list of the people who served in the Congress, at least within the Democratic Party anyhow. 2 terms, out. 2 terms, out. Rotation. Now they might go on. Hamlin goes on and becomes a senator and so on. But it was a practice considerably different than today. But it meant that all these things tend to give leverage for these third parties, if third parties should appear. It went on all the way up through the congressional district conventions. You had ward caucuses, county conventions, congressional district conventions, state conventions, committees in each one of those. I mean, there was a superstructure of political organization that was so extensive that it's almost mind-boggling. In 1844, an attempt was made in the Congress to, and indeed an attempt to pass to get a committee through to get a treaty through the United States Senate. A treaty had been signed with Texas to annex Texas to the United States. It failed because of the opposition of people who saw this as adding slave territory or a slave state to the United States. Ultimately, it was added at the tail end of the John Tyler administration. Tyler was that sort of half Democrat that had been elected as a Whig. Through joint resolutions of both houses of Congress, Texas was annexed to the United States. And it kicked off some furor in the North by people who were opposed to this. Now, by that time, the abolition movement had passed beyond the assimilative stage into the coercive stage, and in 1840 the Liberty Party had been established as a national political party. It wasn't too extensive in terms of its coverage of the country. Certainly weren't too many Liberty Party people down south of the Mason-Dixon line. And it ran a presidential candidate in 1840 and ran another one in 1844. The first time the presidential candidate got something like 7,000 votes, and the second time they got something like 12,000 votes out of millions of votes cast. But by 1800 and after the annexation of Texas, of course, a war broke out with Mexico. And the Mexican War really was the first major incident tending to split the Democratic Party along sectional lines. Generally, there was opposition, especially in the Whig Party in the North, but also a minority of the Democratic Party in the North opposed the Mexican War on the grounds that it was going to add slave territory to the United States. Now, by 1848, when these matters were being debated and decided, the Liberty Party in the 1848 presidential elections became expanded by the addition of northern anti-slavery Democrats into what was called the Free Soil Party. And the Free Soil Party was opposed to the annexation of Texas, but of course it had already taken place. It opposed any acquiring of any more territory from Mexico, and this anti-slavery attitude penetrated into the Democratic Party of Maine, as it did indeed the Democratic Party in other parts of the United States. Now, ultimately, the question of what to do with the territory that we acquired from Mexico was decided by what is known as ought to be ended. There had been a big petition campaign back in the 1830s to do that, but it was still going on. Ultimately, a compromise was put together in 1850, which said that after a very famous debate in the United States Senate, in which Hannibal Hamlin participated, along with John C. Calhoun and Daniel Webster and so on, the great figures of the Senate of that day, a compromise was worked out in which California was brought into the Union as a free state, thereby balancing off Texas, which had come in as a slave state. The status of slavery in those areas that have ultimately became the territories of New Mexico and Arizona was left for the time being undefined. By and large, there was no one living there except the Indians anyhow at that point. And the Southerners agreed that slavery in the District of Columbia could be abolished if the Congress would enact a fugitive slave law, which would facilitate the return of runaway slaves to the Southern slave owners. So those essentially were the elements in the Compromise of 1850. And at first there were objections by many so-called conscience Whigs in the North, and including in the state of Maine. The Portland Advertiser, for example, editorialized as the Compromise of 1850 was being enacted through the Congress, said, "Let us advocate the abolition of the slave trade in the District of Columbia and wherever the authority of the general government extends, that is under federal control. Now let us stop here, but do everything in our power to abolish on just terms the cause itself, the curse itself, in the District of Columbia." That is, they're calling for the abolition not only of the slave trade, but of slavery as well in the District of Columbia. Let us oppose every act of Congress which may in any shape protect or uphold slavery. Let us oppose to the last, this is 1850, let us oppose to the last the addition of a single inch of slave territory to our Union. Now that last phrase about not allowing an addition of a single inch comes to be the position of the Republican Party. No further extension of slavery is the catchphrase that the Republican Party ultimately comes to use. Now Hannibal Hamlin had spoken out vigorously against any further extension of slavery in this debate on the Compromise of 1850, referring to slavery as abhorrent to all mankind, quote unquote. As Hamlin had been elected to the Senate with Free Soil support, he was a Northern Democrat that had been elected with Free Soil support, again because U.S. Senators then in those days were elected in the state legislature, and the Free Soil Party, which had begun to elect some people to the Maine legislature, were in a position to exert influence beyond their numbers because of the relatively even balance of the Whigs and Democrats in the state legislature. So the slavery issue, which had caused a furor in the latter part of the 1840s and was temporarily compromised, because even though the conscience Whigs in Maine did not like slavery, and even though Hannibal Hamlin did not like slavery and had spoken out against it and so forth, for the time being in the early 50s, both parties, the Whig and the Democratic, both nationally and within the state of Maine, said, well, all right, that compromise then takes care of the slavery question. And some of these people were hoping perhaps that it was going to, in the state of Maine, stop some of the conflict that had been going on. However, Neil Dow prevented that from happening. because his agitation for controlling drinking in Maine, which had gone through a local option law in the 1830s, and what is known as a 28-gallon law in 1846, where you couldn't buy liquor in less than 28-gallon quantities, which was not being very well enforced. But again, he had gotten that law through. 28 gallons, that's about a month and a half supply, right? By 1800 and the early 1850s, he had run for mayor of Portland, and very cleverly, he was an excellent organizer, political organizer at the local level. And it's interesting to read his memoirs, because in them, which were written in the latter part of the 1870s, the earliest reference that I have to recall ever seeing of someone saying that he was attempting to influence public opinion. Public opinion was this kind of expression that we find commonly used back in the 1870s, 1880s, more of a 20th century public relations thing associated with the 1920s, 30s, and so forth. But he used that phraseology that far back. He was good at it. He got himself elected as mayor of Portland, and he got a massive petition submitted to the Maine state legislature asking that a prohibitory law be enacted. In essence, what it was going to require was that every town have a liquor agent, and liquor could only be sold through that liquor agent. And liquor could only be sold in these large quantities for medicinal or mechanical industrial purposes. He went to the legislature with these petitions. The temperance organizations had been lobbying with these people for years, and he was able to engineer that law through the state legislature. What is known as the Maine law, which became a model for similar laws in a number of other states. The Maine law of 1851. Now this split the older parties. That is, there were Democrats who hated it, and there were Whigs who hated it, and there were Democrats who loved it, and there were Whigs who loved it. And its effect, in terms of what I'm interested in here, is that it was corroding the old party structures. It was a divisive issue, highly divisive. People became very emotional about it. Very emotional as non-smokers and smokers are today. Now, it was in this context, 1851, and they were still arguing about the liquor law, 1852-53, after it was in effect. In 1854, there are reasons that are still puzzling to historians. Stephen A. Douglas, a very prominent Democratic senator from the state of Illinois, introduced a bill in the Congress which later was modified, became known as the Kansas-Nebraska Bill. What it was a bill to create two territories out of the Louisiana Purchase area, one called Kansas, one called Nebraska. Apparently it had something to do with Douglas's desire, one, to get a great deal of talk at this time about building western railroads and clearing the way by establishing territorial governments and dealing with the Indians within the areas of Nebraska and Kansas, clearing the way for a central railroad line via Chicago, which he was from Illinois, out to the west coast, where we had acquired California, and also may have had something to do with his presidential ambitions and his desire for support from the South for those ambitions. Or whatever the motivation, he introduced this bill into Congress, and what it called for was a repeal of, and this particularly was of interest to people in Maine, a repeal of the Missouri Compromise, in as far as it prohibited slavery in the area of the Louisiana Purchase. It did not say so, but what Douglas and his supporters anticipated was that Kansas would slave directly west from Missouri, and this westward migration rule or idea that slave owners in the state of Missouri would migrate westward into Kansas. Kansas become a slave state, eventually come into the Union as a slave state. Nebraska was west, wherever Nebraska is west of, Iowa, I guess, and it would eventually be populated by people who did not own slaves, and these two states could come into the Union at the same time. Well, of course, things did not work out that way in Nebraska. There was a general outcry against the Kansas-Nebraska Act in the state of Maine. Of the 50-some newspapers published in Maine at that time, that's right, 50, 45 of them opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Only 5 of them thought that it was a good idea. There was outrage in the state of Maine and generally in much of the North over this Kansas-Nebraska Act. It was repealing what was commonly called the Sacred Compromise. Or at least they began to call it the Sacred Compromise at that time anyway. The Compromise of 1820. And of course it had particular impact in Maine because of Maine being part of that, the admission of Maine as a state being part of that compromise. Mass meetings were held to oppose the Kansas-Nebraska Act in Maine. What were called mass meetings without respect to party. They weren't Whig meetings, they weren't Democratic meetings, they were meetings of outraged people. Whigs attended them, Free Soilers attended them, moral, what were called woolhead Democrats in those days attended them. The principal mass meeting that was held in the state turned out thousands of people. Speeches were made denouncing Senator Douglas, denouncing increasingly what was coming to be called the Southern Slaveocracy. Harriet Beecher Stowe attended this meeting. Her with her husband sat up on the platform, and of course in 1851 she had published her famous novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, and then in 1852 it published what was called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is all the evidence upon which the novel was based about the maltreatment of slaves and so forth. Now in the 1854 elections, not only the state elections but also in the congressional elections, fusion parties was put together, which included so-called conscience Whigs, or Whigs who were opposed to any extension of slavery, the woolhead or northern oriented Democrats who were in opposition to the southern influence in the Democratic Party, and the Free Soilers who were opposed to any kind of further slave territory. They put together fusion ticket of fusion candidates in the congressional districts and in the state senatorial districts and so on. And the end result was that what will become the Republican Party took control of the state, even though at that point, at the time of the election, it was not called the Republican Party. It was simply called a fusion slate. And the fusion legislature that was elected passed a set of resolutions, which is indicative of where it stood, this Republican Party becoming born. It condemned the institution of slavery, flatly condemned it as antithetical to American principles. It condemned the repeal of the Missouri Compromise and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It called for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. It called for repeal of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that was allowing slave owners to better regain control of their slaves. And it enacted a personal liberty law, which interestingly enough made district attorneys the representatives for any runaway slaves who came into the state of Maine to defend them against southern slave owners trying to get them back. The fusionists in the legislature had a caucus in which they called for a fusionist state convention, and that convention was held, and at that convention it adopted the name Republican Party. The Republican Party from that point on, with one exception, moved into a position of dominance in the state of Maine. In 1855, and I won't take time to go into the details of it, there was a liquor riot in Portland. To be somewhat facetious about it, there were a group of drunken Irishmen who stormed the city hall in Portland, where Mayor Dow was holed up guarding his liquor. And in the process, the militia was called out, and shooting occurred, and one individual was killed, and a few others were injured. And it was a real black eye for the Republican Party, which by this time had adopted the anti-liquor position of Dow. And as a consequence, in the 1855 election, the first time that the Republican Party had run as a Republican Party, it got beaten, got kicked out of office in the state. However, they regrouped, and in 1856, there was a conscious effort to bring into the party more what might be described as mainline politicians. Now, William Pitt President had come into the party in 1855. In 1856, Hannibal Hamlin was inundated with requests that he drop out of the Democratic Party. A strong anti-slavery man, that he drop out of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party had fallen, was argued, under control of Southern slaveholders. And he finally agreed to do so. He was a senator, and everyone assured him, look, you can remain a senator, and you can still run for governor. You don't have to quit being a senator until such time as you're elected as governor. I always thought about that. Thought that sounded like a good deal. He did agree that if he didn't win the election for governor, that he also would resign from the Senate. I mean, he wasn't trying to have his cake and eat it too, really. And the Republicans came back strongly in 1856 and established themselves as the dominant party in the state of Maine. The scope of their election, and it's indicative of what happens with the Republican Party in the future in Maine for the next 30 years. And they won the state Senate by 30-1, and they won the House of Representatives in the state of Maine by 126-23, which you might call sweeping election victory. Republicans solidified their control in the state of Maine over the succeeding years. In the 30 years after 1856, from 1856 to 1886, in terms of members of Congress, during that period, there's 30 times 5, about 100, roughly 150 people, 150 congressional seats were voted for, and only 5 non-Republicans got elected in that 30-year period. So this established dominance of the Republican Party. And of course, it went on after 1886. It went on right down, really, until, by and large, down until the 1950s. Now, the Republican Party was also established nationally as the party that was militantly opposed to any further extension of slavery, and ultimately had assumed the position, as Lincoln had indicated in his House Divided speech, which is very tardy, in 1860, that ultimately slavery was going to be ended in the United States. They'd gotten a position where it wasn't going to be allowed to be extended any farther, and that ultimately it was going to be ended. And of course, that was what the southern slaveholding states could not swallow, and why they went the way that they did. Well, thank you. Any questions?